All right, welcome back, folks, to our final session here. That's right, it's 3 days about to come to the end, and we're going to round it out with quite the treat. Our keynote speaker to close this out is going to be PJ Hagerty here to talk you through DevOps, the philosophy versus the practice of it, and how sometimes they just don't seem to line up. Take it away, PJ.
Thanks so much, Darren. I appreciate it. Let me get my slides up and running here because that's going to be really important. All right. So, as Darren said, my name is PJ Hagerty. I'm here to talk about DevOps philosophy versus practice. A little bit about me. I am in the developer relations industry. So, that means I get to travel the world and see great places. Do most of these things virtually now. I'm also a musician. I used to coach hockey. I also, at one point in time, let my 11-year-old keynote RubyConf. So, that was an interesting experience. Feel free to ask me about that later. At DevRelate, we do developer and community relations as a service. So today I'm here representing Mattermost, but we also work with companies like Scout APM, Paradis AI, Monk.io, which is a great Kubernetes alternative. I'll probably mention it later. Sema Software and Carrick. So that's not really what we're here about. Let's get to what we are actually here to discuss. So DevOps. What is DevOps? To say DevOps is a buzzword at the moment would be like a severe understatement. But like, what really is it? Is it just the new agile, or is it tooling built to bring the development and operation sides together? There's always talk and discussion about the philosophy of DevOps. You'll see that a lot of DevOps events. Such discussions often include big, huge presentations on what it means, yet they often touch on only one aspect of DevOps, such as like the on-call experience or incident management, automation, how dev meets ops. But rarely do we take and look at all of these parts examined together at once. Here today, for this talk, we're going to try to put the philosophy and the tools together all in one place. In order to do that, we need a definition of DevOps as it stands today. According to the strict definition of DevOps, and I'm going to put on my special definition voice, it is a concatenation of development and operations, a method that emphasizes collaboration between the entire spectrum of professionals involved in creation, development, and deployment of software. So that's pretty straightforward. But it's also very kind of utopian and esoteric. Like, we didn't really define anything. We defined any place that actually develops an application and also deploys it to the world. But we didn't say anything about it. So let's see if we can dig a little deeper and get into the modern concept of DevOps. Before we go too much further, we should probably break down each of the pieces. So we're going to start with the obvious part, which is development. Is this obvious, though? I mean, are we talking about any code that gets written? Are we talking just about back-end code that serves the functionality of the application? Do we consider front-end code or UI UX important at all in this mix that is DevOps? What even is development? See, it's a philosophical talk, so occasionally I have to look off into the distance and be philosophical. So bear with me with this. So for our purposes, for what we're going to discuss today, we'll say anything I just mentioned is development. The whole kit and caboodle, UI, UX, back-end code, everything that you write that's code is development. Next, we have QA. This is the part of DevOps people tend to forget about the most. Mostly because you can't put it in the word DevOps because DevQuops didn't really ring well, didn't have a role to it. So QA is still a majorly important part of the whole cycle. For most organizations, this starts with the developers testing their code. So code tests, unit tests, testing frameworks, things like that. Many times, though, it totally ends there as well, unless we have a large enough organization to have a dedicated QA team. Now, the problem with the testing ending at the developers is developers often test for exactly what they're looking for. So they say, okay, so this piece of code should allow a user to authenticate. And I'm building an authentication piece that will do exactly that. So it makes it difficult. I mean, you're not really ensuring the quality of the product or the way it's going to be used. So QA teams are kind of important if you're large enough to have one. This could be a few people who are going through end user type interactions, or folks running tests against the system for penetration, security, or it could just be testing for browser interaction, just seeing how the users literally use the thing. Finally, we have ops, or operations, really. So these are the people that we used to call systems administrators or cable jockeys if you were less forgiving. But they're your deployment engineers, your SREs, the folks making sure the cloud implementation works properly and the physical servers are in line with what our organizational and application goals and needs are. Once basement dwellers considered to be the least important people on the team, these people have become so much more important in the hierarchy of any modern company. So today, we think of DevOps as a set of behaviors and tools that allow a team to function. That idea differs a little bit from the agile mindset, which focuses on the ability to move a project along a flexible timeline, hence the word agile, which can be subject to change depending on feedback. Again, agile. It's small, fast, it's open to change. That's the concept, but it's mostly focused on the software development cycle. Once things move beyond the dev, they don't really function in an agile way. DevOps looks beyond development and focuses and encompasses all the steps from concept to delivery of product. That's kind of our working definition now. Knowing the parts, though, doesn't necessarily understand the ideas behind how everything works. The philosophy bringing this to the forefront started somewhere. Back in 2008, Andrew Clay Schaefer and Patrick Dubois introduced the first iteration of what we know now as DevOps, defining it as a set of practices intended to reduce the time between committing a change to a system and the change being placed into normal production while ensuring high quality. That seems to encompass a lot in the current world of development. So maybe we need to modernize the definition. Let's work on that. The philosophy kind of stretches beyond the work cycle. The focus is on how the members of a team function, interact, and can be most successful. This means taking into account overarching pieces of the puzzle: development, testing, integration, deployment, monitoring, systems administration. All of this requires a tool set. And the chain can be long. It can also be short. It can be all one company, it can be all internal. There's going to be a lot of different things that we talk about when it comes to tooling. But here's the thing, there's no single right answer for what's the right tool set. It's more about what works for your organization. And I'm going to say that a lot, so bear with me. Some of the examples I use are things that I've used successfully, and that's why I focus on them. So let's talk about a few DevOps concepts before we get too into the tooling. One of the biggest key concepts of DevOps is this concept of automation. People love automation. Automation is usually an idea that strikes fear into the heart of developers and systems engineers. In reality, the idea here is to kind of eliminate errors, reduce risk, make our jobs easier. Well, everybody is lauding the advent of AI and the ease of machine learning. The truth is, we're writing scripts to help alerting, monitoring, testing, other things that can be made easier on a small scale. Automation is not a way to ditch engineers. Automation and AI are also not quite where modern media and other things would like us to believe. I know that you see a lot of companies saying, "Oh, we're doing this with AI. We're doing this with machine learning." Keep in mind that we still can't get an AI to drive a car properly. We still can't get an AI that will properly behave on Twitter or other social media. We're not there yet. We're not going to be replaced. For right now, when we talk about automation, we're talking about very small changes to very easy to solve problems that we don't need to solve ourselves all the time. That's the key. Another great concept that always comes in here is the idea of chaos. So this often jars the minds of DevOps practitioners or people that are considering DevOps culture. And a lot of people call it chaos engineering, which is always interesting because I don't know what kind of engineering isn't chaos. But are we really going to ditch all of our production servers at peak times? Are we totally going to drop databases randomly? And I asked specifically those questions because for those who don't know, the concept of chaos engineering came about just like that. There's this small company out in California here in the United States. It's called Netflix. It's tiny. They make movies for people to watch. People primarily would watch movies around 8 p.m., 9 p.m. on a Friday night. That was key watching time, the prime time as they call it. They wanted to see how resilient their systems were, so they literally dropped half their production servers at 8 o'clock on a Friday night. How many people do you think noticed? I'll let you answer that to yourself in your head because it's a virtual conference. 0. None of the customers noticed. This helped them learn. 1, we have a pretty resilient system. It's going to take over. We're going to be able to make sure that everything works. That's good news. 2, we actually function on a level where maybe we have too many servers and we can cut down and save costs. These are examples that people use chaos engineering for. It should be something you fear. Another example I like to use is the idea of a fire drill. When you have a fire drill, people often say, oh, so at 3 o'clock, we're going to have a fire drill. Well, that doesn't really, if you know it's coming, you don't really know what's happening. With chaos engineering, you don't know what's coming. You don't have an understanding of what's about to happen. Therefore, you react the way you would in a true emergency. You can learn a lot from the way people react in a true emergency. Another concept with DevOps is the whole idea of ending siloing between different parts of an organization that are working towards the same goal. This does not mean we expect the folks in payroll to deploy the application or for the CEO to run our CI/CD suite. It does mean that application engineers, QA folks, and systems administrators should be working together to make things happen. And that will need some common tools to reach the goal, to reach the point where we can actually work together. So let's talk about some tools. We'll start in development. And when it comes to development tools, there is a never-ending stream of possibility. First off, there's languages. This is often completely dependent on what your application is set to do. A simple web-based application, Ruby, Elixir, those things will work well for you. If you need something more analytical, perhaps Python or R would suit your needs. If you're building a web application and you want to just go with the tried and true, there's always PHP. And if you want just dependability in general, Java and Perl should do what you need. In the modern DevOps scenario, the development language is really not that important. Factually, you can use combinations of languages to get the specific jobs done within your application. To bring the point home, many applications in modern startups and even large corporations use a combination of languages. Ruby, Java, PHP, sprinkle a little JavaScript on top, make it look good. That's not an unusual recipe. That's the recipe for Twitter. That's exactly how they function. Languages aside, the key here is making applications that are usable in order to make our users' lives better and easier. So for those who don't know, before I got into tech, I also studied anthropology. In anthropology, the word technology is meant to be a set of tools that make a human being's life easier. This should also be our focus as developers. That said, we need to make our developers' lives easier as well, which is where things like version control come in. Techniques that make it possible to merge code together. At the moment, the most prominent form of version control is Git. I don't think anyone's surprised to hear that. But there are still plenty of subversion users out there in the world, so let's not just completely exclude them. And we are really lucky in the fact that we don't need to run our own repo servers in this day and age. When I started, you literally had to have your own subversion server somewhere that you could actually push to. For us, it was on a small Dell computer that no one was using and didn't have a monitor half the time. But now we have things like Bitbucket, GitHub, GitLab, like all of these things that can take care of it for us. We don't need to worry about how our code is shared. It's very easy. And they make it easier to share actual code with the public if that's your goal. Like, that's kind of key to a lot of things that I do. And this is, I'll do a little small aside here. You may have noticed that there's a slight edge to the things that I've mentioned in the development section here. Almost everything I've mentioned is open source. This point is generally my biggest and most favorite thing. Open source is the way of the future. If we want DevOps to be successful, if we want our companies to be successful, if we want tech to be successful, open source is the way we need to go. And some of you might be saying, gee whiz, PJ, what did Microsoft do all those things for if it wasn't to, work against open source? Microsoft is the biggest contributor to open source in the world. They understand the value of it. If your company doesn't understand the value of open source, always use Microsoft as the example. In my way less than humble opinion, open source is the only way we can really establish the best world to realize actual DevOps in practice. End rant. Moving on. So testing. Testing has been a hot topic among software engineers for quite a while. There are many parts to testing that tools such as RSpec and other code testing components don't reach. Point of fact, I'm a bad person. I hate talking about testing as much as I hate writing tests, and I hate writing tests. I hate writing tests. It is a nightmare. But it needs to be done. The tools here are simple. We have things like, that are generally in the language that would be language specific, but there's also some tools outside of that, like Selenium, which is used for application and browser testing. WAPT, W-A-P-T, which is an amazing load testing and stress testing tool. and Q-Test, which is a suite of tools used for quality control on your general application. Additionally, there's services like Rainforest QA that perform the testing on your organization's behalf. So this is great. If you're like me and you don't really care for testing, you can go to Rainforest QA, sign up for an account, and they will QA your app for you. Although this is only a partial list, the key here is ensuring the stability of your application before it hits the public. You have to know what it's going to do. And I'm not going to say that you're going to know everything it's going to do. That's impossible. But you can know most of what it's going to do before it actually hits the public. It's crucial that you do this. So testing is also a never-ending cycle. Well, as part of the DevOps cycle, it's kind of part of a cycle unto itself. You test, you analyze, you explain, you return to sender, or you deploy. Moving on. Once your testing has been done, you feel like it's pretty solid, it's good enough to get out there in the world, continuous integration and continuous deployment are the next steps. So continuous integration is not really a new concept, but it does add to the DevOps tool set in important ways. Companies like Jenkins and Circle CI, they've been together working for several years to do this integration of new code into the current operating stack. This could be on sandbox stacks, it could be in production. Totally depends on how solid you feel a deploy can be, how confident you are in your code, and the people who write it. But the key here is to integrate all the pieces together while you're still working on other things. So you don't have to sit there and worry about, merge conflicts and things like that. CI tools actually help you to continuously integrate code with the main production stack. Add to this the concept of continuous delivery, or some people call it continuous deployment, and we start to approach the end game of our DevOps setup, at least from the application side. Like CI, there are great stable CD tools available out there, such as GoCD, which shouldn't be confused with the programming language Go, and with Terraform. Terraform is another great one. There's lots of great CD tools out there. Once we have this, we need the infrastructure. It's time to move on. So if DevOps is a buzzword, I said that at the beginning, it is not alone. It is in good company. Cloud services, containerization, Docker, Kubernetes, and serverless are other buzzwords that are at the forefront of what we used to call hosting solutions. Like programming language, the answers here are organizationally dependent. While serverless may be the wave of the future, some larger companies are just getting into the idea of public cloud. This is not an unusual concept. And it's important here to note that on the enterprise level businesses, they often move at what I call a glacial pace in comparison to the startup world. Startups are flexible. They're able to kind of adapt and adopt very quickly. Regardless of what arena, DevOps philosophy, adoption of cloud infrastructure, use of open source software solutions, generally big tech companies are a bit behind. And I'm not talking about modern tech companies like Facebook, Meta, whatever they're called now, Netflix, Google. No, those are relatively new companies. I'm talking about Oracle, IBM, companies that are kind of large and employ large numbers of people are slower to move and adopt both the philosophies and the tooling necessary. So when I talk about these things, I'm talking about a lot of experience with startups and what's people that are using the cutting and bleeding edge of technology. All right. So while the industry itself is moving forward, it's kind of important to note the adoption of newer infrastructure technologies moves at a much slower pace across the board. For example, those organizations that I was talking about are just now feeling safe about moving to containers, and serverless is just becoming a thought for organizations that large. And although the cloud has become extremely popular, there are many companies that are still using bare metal. And hold on to your hats, there are people that are moving back to bare metal. I don't know why this is happening. This is something I only found out about recently, but bare metal is making a comeback. People want to be able to control their own machines, their own actual physical machines. Isn't that wild? I think it is, but that's just my opinion. So keep that in mind. Infrastructure moves a little bit differently than languages and popularity and things like that. Once you do make a decision on which new infrastructure technologies to adopt, there's a team of system administrators that come along to handle anything beyond the single application server level. This team will include ops experts, troubleshooters, even DBAs who look at issues with databases, database analysts, which operates a little bit differently than application code. These operators systems administrators, DBAs, and deployment infrastructure actually need their own set of tools to see what the underlying infrastructure seems to be doing. They need to extrapolate what's going on under the hood, as they say, under the bonnet in the UK. That was for Darren, who's hosting this great track. Anyway, the whole idea is you have to be able to observe what's going on from the outside system. You'll hear this a lot of times referred to as observability. Observability is key to understanding how your application works. The original definition of observability was literally about engines. The idea that once an engine was completed and up and running, you couldn't actually look to see what was going on with, say, the pistons or what was going on inside. We had to kind of extrapolate and guess by what was going on the outside. Luckily, for a long time, the same thing was true of all of our systems. Luckily, we have these great folks called SREs, site reliability engineers, and they get these great tools like Scout APM, like Elastic Stack, like Humio, that help provide insights into what the applications are doing while they're out there in the wider world, once the people who aren't us are touching them. So the ability to see into that infrastructure and feed that back through the team to improve everything is quintessential to the success of not just the market of the application and development, but also it's the success of the DevOps cycle. It's the end of the DevOps cycle sign that we keep talking about, but it's also the beginning. And this is another place where we need to be careful about buzzwords, though. You will see a lot of marketing folks say, back to AI and ML, but you also see things like real time and instant feedback when there's always an underlying delay. Like I mentioned Humio earlier, and it takes them a few seconds to get things. It's a time series database. It's very fast, but it takes this time. You have to ingest the information, index it, present it. It's generally the 3 steps of monitoring. So when you see things like real time and instant feedback, don't get caught up in that. There's going to be time between you understanding something's wrong and reacting to it. Just a little caveat there. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about what is actually the most important thing when it comes to DevOps, the most important tool in the toolkit. And some people will grow up and be like, PJ, really? But listen, the most interesting part of this tool set used to implement the DevOps philosophy is communication. Tools here are well known. You have things like Mattermost, Slack, IRC, for those of us who are a little bit older, Discord. Things that are used to keep the moving parts moving and working together. This is key to a successful DevOps implementation. It's funny that I decided to include communication as part of the DevOps cycle. Really, there is no organization inside or outside of tech where communication is not the most important thing in the world. Let's be honest. Isn't it really the most important tool of any successful team? Whether working remote or a distributed team or in a single office, communication is always key to success. Now, I know F1 has become a big thing, and I'm going to use them as an example, not tech. And nowadays, they have like all the modern studies. They got the helmets that had readouts with heads-up displays, the whole dashboard thing and the steering wheel. It's very complicated. It's I'm happy just to drive a motorcycle half the time. But in F1, they didn't used to have these things. They used like the whiteboards and just signs to like, yo, hey, you probably need to change your tires. You're gonna blow out. Like that's how they used to work. Technology has brought them a long way, but all of the technology that they use, a vast majority of it at least, is about communication. Whether it's communicating what the car is doing, communicating to the driver. Very successful teams communicate better. That is true in DevOps. That's true in any tech organization. The better we communicate, the better the chance we'll actually have an understanding that we can work together with. The key point here is that DevOps is less about the tools and more about how people work together. I've mentioned plenty of options and I've pointed out what's right for me, and it might not be right for you. What is right for you is the need to begin the process by establishing what your teams need to do. How you can start bringing devs together, ops teams together, QA folks, everyone who's involved in your process, from programming to playbooks. Bring everyone together so they have a better understanding. Now, here I have some links to some of the things that I mentioned. Some of them are learning tools. Some of them are actual tools that you can use. All of these I've used in my own professional development. This is the toolkit I kind of propose. It's not the end all be all. There's other options for every single piece in this particular puzzle. In my experience, I've had success with everything listed here. That said, Test out what works for you and your organization. See what fits and what works smoothly. I'll leave this up for a moment and I'll share the slides online later. So look for it on Twitter. But I will say this: all of these tools still require the piece that is communication. All of these tools don't work unless you can actually take the information you're gleaning from them and giving it out. A lot of times we have a misunderstanding, I should say, between data and information. It's very easy to extrapolate data from a lot of these tools. Information is something that we can take action on. Data is just a set of metrics or numbers that have no meaning until we give it to them. You have to give data meaning to make it information. Information is something you can communicate and share. Something that's important to remember. Again, if you didn't get a chance to get a screenshot of this right now, I will put it up later. With competing tools, it's hard to say what the perfect setup will be. Is DevOps the best philosophy for your organization? Believe it or not, and I know this is crazy because I'm saying it at a DevOps conference, believe it or not, it might not be. It might not be. Establishing this is the first of many steps to realizing the potential of best practices within your team and your organization. DevOps incorporates both the worlds of development and ops and QA. I know we didn't mention QA because it doesn't fit in conveniently, but DevOps development and QA and ops. But it's not only a set of tools to streamline your organization, it's also the philosophy that's applied to those tools. You have to have the two things working in tandem together. And the teams that are working with them need to understand how they all function and move together. Again, the oil that goes on those gears, the grease that you put to make everything work is communication. All of these elements have to come together in order to improve your application, how it interacts out there with end users. Remember, our whole goal is to build a tool, to build technology, to build a platform that helps people out there in the world somewhere. We need to make sure it functions properly before we can do that. By bringing together DevOps philosophy and the tools, you can empower your team to make successful implementations a reality in your workplace. So please take a look at it, learn to communicate, learn to work together. With that, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
All righty. Thank you very much, PJ. That was really informative. Thank you for running us through that. I mean, I'll kick it off because, first of all, I've just got to go there. All right. I'm pretty sure I heard mention of an 11-year-old running a keynote at KubeCon. I think
Not KubeCon. It was at RubyConf in 2013.
okay.
My youngest, who is now 20, gave the keynote about what it was like to be an 11-year-old programmer. And yeah, I'll tell you right now, there's no more terrifying time and stage than you bring an 11-year-old up and you're not 100% sure what they're going to do.
Oh yeah, you kind of like, guys. Can I maybe get a button that mutes his mic just in case, like
Yeah,
at any given second,
exactly.
right? Because you
Yeah,
know where
yeah.
he's
So
going
I
with
mean,
things.
if you'd like to see the video of me absolutely terrified on stage, just look up RubyConf 2013 Katie Hagerty, Katie, and yeah, it's definitely entertaining. I'll put it that way.
I'll have to give that one a check out. All right, looks like we got a few questions coming through. Christianus, first up, are modern deployments really always more cost effective than traditional ones? Now, you're paying a markup fee for platforms like Heroku or FAS solutions. Okay, I'm just gonna like maybe Christianus is very passionate. He does give long. We'll start off with the beginning, right? Are modern deployments really always more cost effective than traditional ones?
The answer to that is no. Like I said, with a lot of the things that we talked about, it's completely organizationally dependent. Sometimes it's application dependent. I have things that I've deployed on Heroku because it's cheaper for me to deploy on Heroku. I have things that sit on a Raspberry Pi because it's cheaper for me to have a small, tiny server that's not. I mean, it's not going to get hit that often. So I mean, really, I would not say that modern deployment is the ultimate answer. PaaS and IaaS and FaaS, all of those things are completely dependent on your organization and their needs. It could be you could get away with having a single server in a co-location facility. That's totally reasonable if that meets your needs. I think a lot of people do get caught up in the whole idea of like, oh, we have to go to AWS and we have to get 28 instances for this app that actually only has 10 users. Like, scale to your capabilities, not to your dreams. I'll say that much.
Yeah, it's something like, well, my background was in software dev, and before that, like the goal was to be a game developer, and the one thing that we get drilled into us is this whole idea of iterating, right? Building up towards what you're looking for. Don't just literally build the
Exactly.
entire house and go, this is amazing, right? It's like if you were to say, I'm going to build a 10-room mansion, right?
Hmm.
And how many people are going to be living in that house? Just me. So
Just me,
could you
just
not?
by myself.
Do you need an entire mansionus? Can you not just maybe start off a little bit small, live within your means? I love the way you brought that across. I found it especially interesting around the whole idea of like people wanting to go bare bones. And you pointed out, a lot of people seem to be surprised by that, but there could be a plethora of different reasons, right? Like, for
Hmm.
example, I think one of the leading ones is in the modern age. If there's one thing that people find harder than ever, it's actually finding a way of keeping your data private, right? Keeping everything out of the
Absolutely.
public eyes.
Yeah, and I think that managing your own secure infrastructure, like that's kind of the bonus to that. Um, that said, I mean, to kind of go back to the idea of living within your means, we've also seen just yesterday there was like a huge data security company that laid off 30% of their workforce because they got a bunch of venture capital and they were like, cool, we're gonna give everybody jobs, and they realize they don't have the income to cover that. Like, this is the always been the problem with the startup game, understanding what it actually means. In the same way that, like, what you're like, security shouldn't be a second thought. Managing your infrastructure shouldn't be a second thought. You need to actually focus on that and look at your needs. You should have specific infrastructure experts in your organization that can inform you and say, like, listen, hey, we need X, we don't need X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I think it's that kind of case of like something that's been a bit of a theme across the days is multiple speakers kind of like alluded to this is this whole concept of like buzzwords or this engagement with things that everyone else is doing, right? It's almost this face factor of like, well, like Facebook is doing or SpaceX or any big fancy company that comes to mind doing it. So we've got to do it, right? It's like, are
Exactly.
you the exact same? Are you saying that you are literally SpaceX or literally Google or whatever the example is?
Right. Yeah. It's something that's something that's bugged me for like, and people even start before they even get to the point of building applications. Like, oh, we're going to be like the Uber for dog walking. Um, you're comparing yourself
What
to
does
a
that
company
even
that's
mean?
ridiculously huge and successful. What does that mean? And they use that model, and it's a terrible model. First of all, no one should be saying, we're trying to fashion ourselves after Facebook. Let's just put that out there right now. Like, just don't. Um, but also focus on what you're bringing that's original and different to the table, not how you compare it to what already exists in the market. And never, now, the funny thing is, I worked for a while at IBM, and I will tell you that IBM is one of the most successful tech companies in the world. It's been around for over 100 years. It has a track record. It has 600,000 employees, and they bring in $80 billion a year. Yet nobody's like, hey, we want to build like IBM. Why not? They're totally stable. They're not going anywhere. They might be a little slower to the party, but at the same time, like, super stable, super flat. You don't see IBM going belly up anytime soon. But you'll compare yourself to SpaceX, which in comparison is a flash in the pan. It's been around for 10 years. And
Yeah.
we don't know their level of success in all reality.
Yeah, it's people are obsessed with the glamour, the celebrityism of it, essentially, right? It's like it's the punchy moment, right? Like a perfect example. I love the way you kind of highlight. It's like maybe DevOps isn't for you. Like at a DevOps conference, how dare you? But it's true, right? Like I think that to kind of put it into a fair point is to use the example of SpaceX or Facebook. That I think the reason you're saying they don't try and be them necessarily is they had a very unique set of circumstances, and also the most beneficial advice you could get is they got there by being ahead of the curve by doing something entirely
By
different,
being
right?
way early. Yeah, exactly, exactly. And like, and it's great that you wanna go out there and do something different. You definitely should go out there and do something different, but don't expect that level of success. And I say the same thing, when people have open source projects and they're like, "Hey, no, hey, I decided to open source this, and I'm sure that everybody in the community is gonna come along and help me." It's like, what makes you sure of that? Um, that's not like, just because GitHub became a thing doesn't mean you can make a second GitHub and be famous. Just because, whatever, Ruby and Rails was a great, web framework and language, doesn't mean you can create a language and it's going to be just as famous. And like I mentioned Elixir during the talk, and Elixir is a perfect example. Elixir has never had the adoption of a Rails or a PHP or anything like that because it came around at the wrong time. We just didn't need it. It's a cool language, it's a lot of fun to code in, but it's just not something that we needed at the time. And that's the I think that's the expectation we need to manage. Like sometimes you might build a thing and it's not the right time for it, especially if you're building a thing that compares very closely to things that are already out there.
Yeah, I think it's the over calibration both ways, right? Like at the moment, everyone wants that gimmick or whatever's new, whatever's flashy.
They want that
But
new
then on the
hotness, yeah.
and then the flip side, like it's almost like the other half that have overcalibrated opposite are these people who are too stubborn about it, right? They don't want to evolve because this is the way I've done it for 5, 10, 20 years and
Mhm.
it's done all right so far. So it's finding that sweet spot, right? Like you said, kind of really just thinking about what are my needs? What do I actually need? And every time I'm looking at the latest or greatest or the ones that have existed for ages, like essentially just write a pros and cons, essentially, right? Just break it down. Do I
Exactly.
need it and why do I need it?
Yeah, I think a great example of that is kind of I mentioned it in the talk. I talk about with communication tools you have things like Mattermost and Slack and IRC. And I know that like probably at least 50% of the audience is like, I have no idea what that is. But there's a small percentage out there that's like, yeah, I still use IRC. There are IRC converters for both Mattermost and Slack. So you can continue to use like Freenode or Libera Node or whatever it's called now. Um,
Mhm.
and use IRC, but send it to Slack and the API sends it back. So you don't have to leave IRC. That's your example right there. IRC is an ancient technology that people are unwilling to completely abandon, even technology out there. But again, with the new hotness, you have things like Kubernetes out there, and everybody's talking about Kubernetes constantly. KubeCon just happened in Valencia. There were like I don't know 8,000 people or something like that, which COVID time scares the hell out of me. But like talking about Kubernetes, and my argument is, I just had a conversation with somebody the other day about this. How many people talk about Kubernetes and using Kubernetes? How many people are using Kubernetes in production?
Yeah,
And I think that
and
there's a big disparity there. They want to say they want to do it. They'd love to do it. But also there's the do they even need to do it because Kubernetes is super complicated for no apparent reason.
and that's the thing, right? Like, there's also the argument that gets thrown in counter is well, it's new. That's why everyone's not
Mhm.
using it yet. Is it hasn't made its way into the system. But it's like that means you need a lot of documentation. That means you need a lot of experts. And I guess the important thing you're trying to get across here is you need to be listening to the market essentially in that situation, right? If the experts aren't
Absolutely.
already appearing, why is that?
Exactly. And if they're not, question the solidity of that thing.
Yeah, most definitely. Right. It looks like we haven't got any questions that have come through since we started the Q&A past the ones we asked. I think wait, or was there might let me give me a sec. I'm checking the comment chat. Some people forget to post it to questions. No, it looks like I think we're good, but I mean, you seem like a really approachable guy, PJ, so I'm sure like your DMs are open if anyone wants to reach out to you and talk about this in
Yeah.
depth.
Yeah. I'm easy. I'm easy to find. PJ Hagerty or Addisplenic, ASPLEENIC on Twitter or GitHub or just about anywhere else. I lost my spleen when I was 19 and I used it as a screen name. So, the Xbox Live, Darren, I know you're a big video game. So if you ever want to play Halo, you can find me under Splenic. That's the way that I play.
Hey man, yeah, I'm more game for that. We'll probably have to get our gamer nerd side off here, right? Right now they're like DevOps. This is DevOps, not
This is the
not
DevOps
gamer.
conference. That's a different conference.
It's the risky run when you bring in an esports person, right? I'm gonna get into it, but
Here's the thing, though. I mean, to be honest, like there's a lot of DevOps adoption in the esport. Like the
yeah,
amount of organization that has to go into those events and go into the just producing a game these days. DevOps is
for
key to
real.
what those people need to do.
Yeah, it's a growing market. Maybe that's not our little roundup tip to make it relevant here. Guys, take your DevOps over to esports. It's not the wild land fully that it once was, so it's a growing opportunity. But you know what? Let's talk about the opportunities here because this is, of course, the final talk. It means we're gonna have to bring it to a close. Big shout out to PJ for rounding out this final day. It was a pleasure to talk to you. But as
Hey,
we come
thanks
to
so
a
much for having
close,
me.
I, you know what? It was a pleasure. It was all my pleasure because I definitely enjoyed talking to you. I'm sure we'll talk more in the future. But before we do round it out, there's some thanks need to go around. This event, it couldn't have come together without our sponsors. So big shout out to Accenture, TechTree, and Rocket Software who made this possible, as well as all of our speakers, not just PJ, across the past 3 days. Thank you to all of you. Without you, it would literally just be me wearing different ties each day, nodding my head, which is less engaging, of course. And a special shout out to everybody behind the scenes, right? Who's made DevOps Pro Europe a possibility. Shout out to them. They're the true heroes, the unsung heroes. I always love the people I get to work with on the production side, the people working tirelessly to get the speakers in. You know, they don't get enough praise, but they really do put in the hours. And finally, a big thank you to all of you at home. Without you, another reason why this wouldn't be possible. Like we need to make sure that we have people watching, or what's the point? So I hope you engaged with it. I hope you found something useful here, and hopefully you'll take that forward. And hopefully we'll see you next time. Hopefully, actually, on top of that, next time we will actually see each other. But you know what? I'm getting ahead of myself. It's still another year to wait. So I guess we go into hibernation, into our basement as we do. Until then, stay safe, stay smart, and we'll see you all again very, very soon.